Good morning. Welcome back. Hope you guys had a good weekend, and got about 2 minutes until class time. Hi, Sebastian. Good morning. Hi, Cordy. Good to see you. Hey, Sky. Hi there, Kylie. Welcome back, everybody. Good morning, Sydney. Hi, Claire. Hi, Brandon and Angel. Good to see you guys. Peachy says hello. Hey, Ben. Good girl, Peachy. She's so cute. It's just such a good girl. Good morning, guys. She could just lay like this all day. It's good girl. Hi, guys. Hi, everybody. All right, Peachy, I'm going to have to set you down. Well, anyway, welcome back, everyone. Thanks again. It's pretty much 10 a.m., so thanks again for your attendance. Today we have an important meeting because we're going to start to transition to the second topic of our semester. Throughout the first, 4 weeks or so, we spent a lot of time talking about, well, all the time talking about the philosophy of religion. But like I think I told you before, there are many different sub-areas and specializations within the field of philosophy. Just like in science, a person doesn't just say, oh, I'm studying science or majoring in science. You say, oh, it's biology, chemistry, physics, or some other more specific field within it. So in philosophy, we've got a breakdown of different specializations. One of them is, of course, philosophy of religion. But there's also ethics, which is next. So that's what we begin with today. The topic, very interesting topic of ethics. So I believe that we've had at least some passing discussion of the word ethics in some of our previous meetings. And maybe it's also a word that some of you already kind of have a vague or somewhat clear sense of what it means. Ethics, just so that I can definitively tell you, it's the theoretical study of morality and moral concepts. So the study of morality. The study of morality and moral concepts. So whenever you're engaged in moral judgment, or when you're subject to moral judgment, like when you look at a behavior, a practice, an institution, and you say, that's really wrong, that's not okay, that's not good. Or in another case, you look at some kind of behavior, action, institution, or practice, and you say, that's a great thing, that's really good, that's righteous, that's just. We make moral judgments of collective behavior, of individual behavior, of policies, and of institutions. And sometimes, of course, we are the subject of the moral judgment of others or of our own moral judgment. Other people sometimes look at your behavior and criticize you on a moral basis, saying, you know, I find fault with what you did, I resent that, that was wrong, shame on you, or whatever. In other cases, you're subject to praise, people saying, you know, good on you, you really did the right thing. So praise to you for standing up for the right action or for the right principles. So sometimes we are subject to moral judgment. Sometimes we engage in moral judgment of others. It's just part of being a human being. So you might be interested to know that there are actually theories that have been well developed in the West that try to give us answers as to what makes an action either good or bad morally. Some of you, probably many of you, think that morality is just, it's not objective. It's just based on individual perspective or point of view. What's right for one person is different for another, and so on. But in fact, some of the most powerful ethical theories that have been developed in the West claim that there are universal principles that are somewhat objective that we could use to structure our moral thinking about different issues and different actions. So we're going to try and take a tour through what are some of the biggest and most well-known ethical theories and systems in the West. In particular, there are two that we're going to focus on. These, I think, are the two main rivals in the space of competition for ethical theories. One of them is utilitarian theory from John Stuart Mill, and then another is the Kantian ethical system of Immanuel Kant. So we're going to start with John Stuart Mill's ethical framework and try to learn all the little details of it. I have 2 lectures set aside for this topic of John Stuart Mill and utilitarian ethics, so that's today and Wednesday. But I want to bring us in very slowly and make sure that we're all on the same page. So first thing I'm doing, just gave you this definition of ethics. It's the study of morality and moral concepts. So now, having that in place, let me ask you if you can chip in a little bit. And I want you to help me list some contrasting moral concepts. So like, you know how when we think of ethics, we sometimes think of a positive and a negative side? Can anybody tell me or give me an example of like a pair of terms that have to do with ethics where they're like binary opposites? Okay, so let's see who can give me something like that. This versus that, and they're kind of on the positive and negative side of the ethical divide. So what's one distinction between 2 moral concepts of that kind? Let me know. So like, you know, a moral concept, this versus that, and you've got like a better and a worse. I don't want to say the words themselves because I kind of want you to have your own ability to write this down. So morally and immorally permissible. Close lane, I think the proper way of putting it would be to say morally permissible and morally impermissible. But let me hold off on your suggestion for a moment because this is actually a little bit more of a technical term that I want to expand on in more detail. So starting from a level of just common sense and everyday, there's good versus evil, yeah? Or like just good and bad. I'll just say good versus bad because, I mean, evil is another synonym, I guess, but it evokes even more extremity of like poor moral behavior than just bad. And I don't want to say that everything that's bad is straight up evil. You know, like if you cheat on a test or something, this is immoral, but it's academically dishonest. I don't know if it qualifies as evil per se, but surely there are bad actions that are evil. So that's fair. Good, bad, and along the same lines, guys. Let me see another example. So now that you get the genre, I'm sure you can give me synonymous examples along the same lines. Instead of good versus evil, we could have what versus what. Honest versus dishonest, sure. That's in one context of moral or immoral behavior, like when it comes to being truthful. But I was thinking something even more generic, you know, because honesty and dishonesty is a way of being good or bad, but applied to a specific set of factors. Light versus dark, I think, Brandon, that's a little bit even overbroad because sometimes those are just tones of, you know, the quality of lighting or something in an area. But yeah, right versus wrong, good. Right versus wrong, good versus evil, honest versus dishonest. Continue along the same lines. You've heard of, like, I'll add one to the list just to give you another thing. Moral versus immoral, right? So the contrary of moral is immoral. What else? We had some good suggestions to start here. Good and evil, right and wrong, moral and immoral. Nothing else? That's it, guys? Come on. Nothing else. Maybe one more. Independent versus dependent. I don't know. Why is either one good or bad, though? It could be good or it could be bad to be dependent on other people. So I don't know if it speaks to a moral divide. Sometimes independence is a good thing, I guess. In other cases, a person may act independently but do something wrong. Selfish versus selfless. Also a fair distinction there, Cordy. But this is kind of like a character trait rather than a moral principle. You say correct versus incorrect. Well, you can have an incorrect math problem that's not evil or immoral. But I kind of understand what you mean, like morally right versus morally wrong, which we already sort of have. How about just versus unjust? Come on. And then in general, since this has to do with action and how a person ought to act, I think, Zoe, I could gesture in the direction of what you're saying here, like a correct versus incorrect action. So how one ought versus how one ought to not act. Okay, so looking at this division of concepts on the left and right, you're starting to comprehend a little bit about the nature of what we think of and discuss within ethics. What makes an action good, or on the other hand, bad? What does it mean for a person to conduct themselves in a way that is right, or on the other hand, wrong? What's the difference between an action defined or labeled as moral as opposed to immoral? What qualifies or constitutes an action as being just or unjust? And in general, what principles describe how a person should be acting morally versus how they should not be acting morally? Whenever you make a judgment on any of these bases of a behavior, an institution, or a practice, and you say what's going on here is wrong, or what these people are doing is just and righteous, or people are doing things that are dishonest, or they're holding up high standards of honesty, whenever you judge an action, practice, or institution on any of these ways, you're engaged in moral reasoning, and that's an ethical judgment. So there's three main kinds of action within ethics. That's the next thing I want to go into, and this is going to bring your comment back into the discussion a little bit, Lane. So there are three main types of actions in ethics. Okay, so we have actions that are classified or labeled as morally impermissible. And contrasted against the opposite, which are actions that are classified as morally permissible. And then finally, a third category are those that are deemed morally obligatory. Okay, so we're going to just try and define these concepts and think of some good examples, beginning with the beginning at the top here. So if an action is morally impermissible, does anybody have a wild guess what that could mean in other words? In more straightforward language or terminology, how would you put it if you had to guess what that means? Morally impermissible. What are we saying when we state that an action that someone did was morally impermissible? This is just, in other words, saying what about the action? What description is that? Morally impermissible. What does it mean? If you could throw out a wild guess or even just a reasonable guess, what do you think? Morally impermissible act means what? You know, just using your own vocabulary and reasoning, using inference. I mean, you see the words involved. Not allowed, right? So the action is not seen as acceptable, correct? These, therefore, yes, are actions that are wrong, morally wrong, and they're not okay to do. They're not permitted by the rules of morality, at least. So good. Actions that are wrong. And to be a little less formal about it, we can simply say these are things that are not okay to do. Now, the next thing I was going to do is, ask you guys for some examples of actions that would fit to that category. Olga, you say one thing, something meant to harm others. Certainly an action that's meant to harm other people would normally be something morally impermissible, unless, you can always imagine possible exceptions, a case of like self-defense or whatever, where you have to harm the attacker. But in general, like willful infliction of harm on others for no valid reason would certainly be wrong. But not every action that's morally impermissible causes like physical harm to other people. I might, I don't know, lie to somebody, and maybe my lie actually makes them feel better, but it's not honest. So some people would argue that that's wrong, even though the intent of the lie itself was to preserve someone's happiness. Like if someone asked me, what do you think about this meal? And I was just like getting sick almost eating it, but I don't want them to know that because they worked hard on it. So I said, oh, it's actually really good. I loved it. I'm not saying I think that's wrong, but some people might argue that dishonesty is generally wrong, even when it's for a good reason. So I don't know. I'm just trying to give you something to think about there, Olga. Like usually an act that is considered impermissible morally might be harmful to someone else. But we can also imagine cases where there's no like significant level of harm, but it's wrong for another reason. Yes, but anyway, let's go into this. If you hear that this means actions that are wrong and they're not okay to do, I'm sure we can come up with some easy and clear examples that are not controversial of what could be some morally impermissible actions. So can anyone give me like a specific case of some action it is wrong and it's not okay? Okay, murder, just sure, Angel, that's way up there at the top. Yes, that's a clear example, murder. If somebody, committed the craven, sadistic act of murder, killing another person, ending their life, not in self-defense or for cause, like judicial or otherwise, but rather just out of homicidal desires, that's got to be one of the worst things that anyone could do, right? Because the human life is so precious, and eliminating it from all future experience is to deprive one of the most amazing things that anyone could be deprived of. So that's definitely way up there, high on the level of how bad something could be. But that's not the only wrong action, of course. And I see some others here. Sydney, you say stealing. Sure, yeah, stealing, committing theft, taking things that you don't own without any valid transfer of ownership through gift or through purchase. That's certainly wrong because you don't have a right to other people's property since they have earned it through their own labor or income. So yes, that'd be a clear case. In all of these examples, sometimes people can dream up a possible counterexample, like, oh, what if someone was stealing to feed their family a loaf of bread? I don't know. You can imagine some isolated circumstances where a person may say there's exceptions to the general rule that stealing is wrong, but overall, good case. We know that stealing is considered wrong. Committing fraud, yeah, another good example, Dennis. It's sort of similar to theft, but a fraudulent enterprise in some cases may just be selling a false bill of goods, which of course deprives people of their money without providing them with full information on the product or service they're getting or the value of it. So you say fraud, theft, murder. Anything else, guys? There's a lot more under the sun that you haven't even scratched the surface. Genocide, rape, torture. We could go on and on and on. So anyway, these are things that are wrong to do and they're not okay to do. They're morally impermissible acts. Now we go to the next category, morally permissible. Cheating would be another good example, Sydney. And coming back to your comment, Olga, you might argue that cheating doesn't hurt anybody. It doesn't hurt the professor. It doesn't hurt the individual who gets the better grade because they cheated. But of course, I don't know if I should even say that. They're harming themselves in a way because they're depriving themselves of information that would make them a more fully informed human being and citizen. And I guess they also do damage to our institutions, which pass through these people that have cheated if they do, and therefore, harms their reputation if it ever be discovered later. So I guess there's a way of looking at harm. But a good example is cheating also, Sydney. Next, though, morally permissible. Who can help me here? What do you think is the definition of a morally permissible act? So just using logic, I think you can figure that out by contrasting it to this. These are acts that are wrong and they're not okay. So morally permissible acts are the opposite. What do you think then they are by definition? These would be acts that are what? Let me know what you think under this heading, morally permissible. So you gave an example, Angel, like to volunteer, and that's good. But before we get to the examples, we have to have the definition first. So Olga, you're saying this. Okay, I was confused before, but that helped. Wouldn't morality then be up to the individual? Well, no. I mean, that's the whole point. We're studying ethical theories. According to these theories, what's moral is objective, and it depends on the answers to objective questions, like how much pleasure is generated by the different actions, or does the action conform to principles of reason or something that could be stated objectively. But we'll get to that in a moment. Olga, you say actions accepted by society. I don't know if we need to refer to social norms or anything like that. You say acts that are seen as okay. I noticed that you guys have this heavy thought of like, it's all about how people think. It's about what people agree to. Like if society says it's right, then it is. It's morality though. It's a little bit beyond just what a society chooses. It's supposed to be something that's like built into the nature of right and wrong. But you guys are on the right track. These are actions that are not wrong, and they are okay to do. Okay, so very good. Acts that are not wrong. In other words, they are okay to do. Okay, now notice one thing. You might have first had the instinct, should these be acts that are right? Because that's the opposite of acts that are wrong. Yes, right and wrong are like moral contraries. But I think it's better to put this in the more minimal way, actions that are not wrong, because the terminology right kind of evokes thoughts of noble self-sacrifice, righteous acts that really benefit others to a high degree. And yes, those are morally permissible, but it's not limited to those valorous and noble actions. It can also just be all the little daily things that don't necessarily help anybody, but they're also not blameworthy against you. Like say, for example, I chose to wear this red V-neck sweater today. That's not an act of charity. It's not helping anyone in the world or anything, but it's not wrong. No one can look at me wearing this and say, what are you doing with that? That's evil. That's immoral that you're even wearing that. So it's not wrong. It's okay for me to wear it, so it's morally permitted. Morally permissible acts then encompass a pretty broad range. Maybe someone else can think of some other examples here. So let me ask you for that. Angel, I see you already have one. To volunteer, sure. If what you meant was like volunteering time or money for a worthy cause, working at a food bank, giving clothes or cans of food to like a homeless shelter, you know, sure. But let's see if there's other actions. What else can maybe be put in this category? I hope it's easy to come up with examples because you guys all seem like a very moral group of people. So just looking at your own life, almost 100% of your behavior, I would assume, comes out of that category. So you can just select some random examples. What are some other things, guys, that you think are also morally permissible? Taking this class. Okay, good, Sydney. Yeah, I mean, taking a class in college just for your education and knowledge, is certainly nothing wrong with that. I mean, I know it is philosophy, so maybe some people are going to think there's something wrong with studying philosophy, but no, trust me, it's not evil. Hobbies. Okay, good. Depending on what a person's hobby is, that might have to be specified. But in general, yeah, hobbies are just pastimes that amuse you and give you some joy and entertainment. But as a philosopher, you guys have to know, right? I'm trained to always think of, is there any counterexample? I think of hobbies and my mind starts lighting up with, well, what if the person's hobby is something that some people think is wrong, like hunting or I don't know. But sure enough, yeah, fair enough. I got your example, art, sports, etc. Being kind or helpful in just general, yeah. It's hard to think of an exception to that. I guess maybe if you're being kind or helpful to like a fugitive of justice that's trying to escape detection by the law, maybe that's wrong, but generally I think I know what you mean. Donating, correct, yeah, donating to a worthy charitable organization or something like that. So all kinds of stuff is morally permissible. You guys have got a lot of good examples. But keep in mind, it's also just random stuff that's not too helpful to anybody, as long as it's not harmful or blameworthy in a way that creates some kind of victim or anything. Okay, now finally, morally obligatory. This is even a little beyond what's permitted, and using the language here, maybe you can derive what the definition is. If it's morally obligatory, what, in other words, do you think that means? What kind of action is morally obligatory? It's an action that, what? What does it mean to say it's obligatory, in other words? Because obligatory is a little bit more than permitted. Permitted, you may do it. But obligatory, what do you think that is? It's one's duty, yeah, so it's required. These are morally like required actions. These are things you may do, but these are actions that morally you must do, and it would be wrong not to do them. So these are like morally mandated or required acts that you must do. and it's wrong not to do them. Okay, so morally obligatory actions, actions that you must do, and it's wrong not to do them. It may be a little harder for you to come up with examples at first of the morally obligatory actions, so I just totally understand that if it's like you can't think of a quick example, but does anybody maybe have something in mind? Because I could certainly give you some options if nothing comes up. But what would you say if you could think about it that is an action you're morally required to do and it's obligatory? It's not really optional. Failure to do it would be wrong by itself. Like what? Because like say, right, me wearing the sweater, we said that's morally permissible because I'm allowed to wear it and it's not wrong, but I'm not required to wear it either. Like it's not mandatory that I wear this sweater today. So I may do it, but I'm not having to do it. Courting, if you have a child, to keep them safe, aid their development. That's a good example, right? Well, only possible exceptions would be if the person doesn't take custody of the child, like they have a child, but they give the child away to an adoption agency. But yes, certainly if a person has a child and then takes the child in as their own, then they take on all the obligations that come with the parental role. So their care, upkeep, shelter, food, and so on. You wouldn't say, oh, well, they may take care of the kid if they want to, but that's just their option. That's mandatory morally. So that's a good one. Now, Angel, you say wearing a seatbelt. Why? I mean, why is that morally? That's not morally obligatory. You might say that it's a legal obligation, and sure it is. But there's a difference between what you have to do under the law and what's moral. So that's an important point that I actually was hoping that we would get to, because it always has to come up in these discussions of ethics to know the difference between legal and moral permissibility. So wearing a seatbelt, right? The reason that you're required to wear it is kind of the government is trying to protect you against your own foolish decision to drive without your seatbelt strapped on. But who's really being protected? It's not a third party. It's not like you're going to harm other people if you fail to wear a seatbelt. You're just going to hurt yourself. So some people, and in fact, when the laws were instituted, some people, like libertarians and stuff, were saying, don't tread on me, don't give the government the right to tell me I can't drive around with no seatbelt if I don't want one. Because if I'm going to get hurt in an accident, I'm fine with that, and it's nobody's business. It's like people who don't want to wear a helmet if they drive on a motorcycle, right? Some people just want to feel the wind blowing in their hair. Is it a foolish decision? Is it an unwise decision? Is it dangerous? Sure. But whether it's morally wrong or not depends on what your view is of the state's role in enforcing safe conduct for individuals that's not harmful to others. So it's a controversial example, but I would say it's not a moral obligation, it's a legal obligation. Dennis, helping your parents when they grow older, sure. Although there's exceptions to that. Some people are very bad parents that are abusive to their kids, and the kids just can't wait to get away from them and never have anything to do with them. So in a generic case where you have good parents that have cared for you like they should, I would say that is an obligation, but it's a little bit of a case by case almost. So moral obligations, they can also be generated by promises or vows that you make. Suppose that I promise someone that I'll pick them up at the airport because they don't have a ride, they don't want to call a Lyft or whatever. And then they're waiting for me, and I never pick them up. They call me, they're like, where are you at? You said you'd be here 30 minutes ago. And I say, yeah, I know I said that. I was just saying that because I wanted to get you stranded at the airport. I never intended to come. I made a false promise. And right now I think it's funny that you're there. So you hang up. That would be wrong. That would be immoral because you made a promise. So once you promise to do something or you vow to do it, then you generate an obligation. You establish an obligation to do it. If you wanted to be free to not do it, then you can't promise to do it. But notice that the promise has moral force, but no legal force, at least in this one case. It's not a contract. So the person on the other end of the line can't say, well, I'm going to call the police. I'm going to file a report against you because you did promise me to get me at the airport. That's not a crime, but it's still something immoral. And so now I'm trying to let you guys know that there's a difference between morality and the law. A false mistake that a lot of people make when they start thinking about ethics is it's just whatever the law says. So if the law says something is illegal, it's wrong. And if they say it is legal, then that's permissible morally. Not necessarily, because obviously there can be, if that was true, then there would never be any legitimate basis to morally criticize an existing law. And there would never be a moral basis for civil disobedience, which of course there is. Can anybody here think of any action or practice that was at one time legal, but reasonably we could say it was wrong, it was immoral, even when people allowed it to happen under the law. Give me an idea about what I'm mentioning here. So something that had been legal, but was still wrong if you think about it morally. Okay, there you go, slavery. That's a clear example, Zoe. And it's not the only one, but it's just one that we can use for now. Slavery, as you all know, is a horrible institution. It's treating people like their property, selling family members apart from each other, forcing them to work in bondage and servitude without any kind of compensation or rights. It's clearly an immoral institution, but it was legally protected for a long time. And so if you had, let's say, tried to escape slaves like Harriet Tubman did before the Civil War, you would have been violating the Fugitive Slave Act, and that would have been considered a crime. But we don't think of those people as evil, deviant, immoral people nowadays, right? We recognize that they did the right and just thing, even though they had to violate the law to do it. Or you guys have made the case about discrimination, segregation. Yeah, after slavery ended, of course, we had all these Jim Crow laws for a long time, and state-enforced segregation, separate but equal doctrine. And the laws that existed under those norms and standards, you could say, was also a bad status quo that had to be changed. So if we didn't recognize the difference between law and morality, then we would never have any basis to say, let us reform the laws, because what they say that is illegal is not really wrong, or what they say is legal should be prohibited and is wrong. Nazi Germany, for example, citizens would have been held liable under the laws that existed if they were giving safe harbor to Jewish people that the Nazis were trying to exterminate. But of course, people that gave safe harbor to, like Anne Frank and so on, these people are not having done anything wrong on their moral record, even if they had transgressed the laws that existed. So when you think about ethics, guys, in the philosophical sense, you kind of have to think about it as the legislator, him or herself, not the subject to the laws, but the one that chooses whether it should be a law or not. Imagine yourself a legislator and the law comes before you, legalize marijuana or something, right? If you're going to vote on this bill, you can't say, well, I'm going to vote based on what the law tells me to do, because you're making the law, right? So instead of thinking of yourself as just subject to these laws and rules, imagine yourself as the legislator who has to engage in original judgment as to whether the thing should be right or wrong. That's when you're thinking about the moral basis of the acts rather than their legal basis. Like even today, there's plenty of people that are pro-life that think that abortion is immoral, even though it's protected under the law, under the Roe v. Wade decision from 1973. So sometimes we think the law allows conduct that is wrong, like slavery, and sometimes we think the law prohibits conduct that is not wrong. Like some people think, I don't know, laws against certain recreational drugs shouldn't be on the books because using them is not in and of itself wrong, even though the law federally says you shouldn't do it. Okay, so we've gone through different categories of actions. I've given you some decent examples of things that fit into the categories. What we are going to now do, one more thing though, let me not speak too soon. Last thing is this. There's a logical relationship between morally impermissible and morally obligatory actions, because not doing what you're obligated to do is impermissible. So say that you got served a meal at a restaurant and you didn't pay. Well, you were morally obligated to pay because the service was rendered unto you at a cost to the merchant. So you're obligated to pay, therefore it's impermissible not to. So not doing whatever you're morally obligated to do is impermissible. Like not keeping a promise or a vow. You promise when you marry to love, honor, obey the other person, stay faithful. Let's say you cheated on them. Then that would be violating a promise, which was an obligation. And by the way, the non-performance of what's wrong is an obligation. So for example, you said it's morally impermissible to murder, and it is. So since that's impermissible, you're morally obligated not to do it. Okay, so like not doing these things is obligatory, and not doing these things is wrong. Okay, so now we're going to learn a little bit about ethical theories. The next step for us is to understand that there have been different writers in history who have tried to define what it is that makes an action a member of one of those three categories. Because every action that you do is going to be one of those three things. It's either going to be something that you shouldn't be doing, or that it's okay for you to do, or that you really have to do morally. So we would like to know how to classify actions according to these different labels. And ethical theories give us principles that help us do that. So I said there are two main big ethical theories, and we're going to learn about both of them. But we're starting with this one first, and it's called utilitarianism. Okay, now this is an ethical theory created by, well, there's a couple of forefathers of the theory, but the one that I think should get the most credit and the one that we really focus on in our book is this man, whose name is John Stuart Mill. Okay, now John Stuart Mill, he lived from 1806 until 1873, so 19th century, and he was a British philosopher, economist, and also he briefly served in the Parliament during his life, which is the British equivalent of like our Congress. So he was also a legislator and a statesman. He had an interesting mix of views in his life. On the one hand, he would be what we would call today like a libertarian, meaning that he thought that the government should have the least power which is necessary for maintaining social order, but no more than that. So he would have been a fan of limited government and the idea that the state should not interfere with private conduct as long as it does not affect other people and their well-being. So so-called victimless crimes that don't actually harm others, he would have said the state has to give people the liberty to do that and not tread on me, as it were, by interfering in private conduct. So like if a person wanted to drink alcohol or use drugs, prostitution, gambling, those kind of things, he would have said you should be at liberty to do because they don't harm anybody else. At the same time, though, he had a certain number of progressive views for his time. Like he was a champion of women's rights. He thought women should be allowed to vote everywhere. He thought that slavery should be abolished everywhere. So he had an interesting kind of mix of different views. But what he's most well known for are his philosophical writings, and in particular his discussions of utilitarian ethical theory. So that's what we are going to talk about here. Okay, so first of all, to understand utilitarian ethics, you have to understand the main motto or creed that holds it all together, and it's this principle. Utilitarianism basically says that you should always do the action which creates the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people. So here I'll write that down. Act always to promote the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people. That is a very brief summary statement of the theory of utilitarianism. So if this ethical theory was the one that a person believed in or agreed with, then they would say, when I'm trying to do the right thing, what I should do is whichever action I have open to me that would lead to the most overall happiness for all affected. So like if you had, let's say, a set of options and you're trying to choose which one is the right thing to do, A, B, C, and D, 4 choices, right? If you were a utilitarian in your moral thinking, in your moral compass, then what you would do is you would game out the 4 different actions and think about how much total happiness would be generated as a consequence of each one. And whichever one would yield the greatest amount overall of happiness, that would be your obligation to do it. And the others, which by comparison would generate less total happiness, would therefore be considered impermissible in contrast. So if you're a utilitarian, you would always be trying to gauge how much total happiness would be the product of all the actions that I could take at any given time. And then you would merely be told to, you'd be obligated morally, according to the theory, to select the act that would generate the maximum yield of total happiness by comparison with the other alternatives. Now, another point to know about the utilitarian ethical system is that it's a member of a family of theories that are called consequentialist. Okay, so quick note about some terminology. What is consequentialism? So the word consequentialism has the term consequence built into it, and that's intended because consequentialism as an ethical system thinks that it's the consequences of an action that determine the morality of the action. So the morality of an action is determined by its consequences. Sorry, it's a little bit trailing off there, but you can hopefully read it, and I'll just say it also. Consequentialism definition. The morality of an action is determined by its consequences. Okay, so utilitarianism is a member of this family of theories. As an example, I'm Richard Vulich, that's my name. My family name is Vulich, and I'm the Richard member of that family, but there's also my brother Danny and David and others. So this is like a family name, and utilitarianism is one member of that family, but there are also other kinds of consequentialist theory aside from it. What they all bear in common, though, including this, is that they think it is the consequences that come from the action that matter in terms of whether it was right, wrong, or something in between. Now, consequences are to be thought of as the effect of what you do, the results that come from whatever it is that you do. As a helpful, perhaps small diagram, here's a person, suppose, a stick figure. Suppose they do an action, and this arrow stands for time that passes after they do the action. At the tail of the arrow, I'm drawing the letter C and kind of highlighting it with these little dashes around it to stand for consequences. These after-the-fact consequences that come from your action, they determine whether what you did was right or wrong according to this family of theories. So if the consequences are good in some sense to be described, then that action is good and right. If the consequences are bad in some sense to be described, then that action is bad and wrong. So consequentialist ethical thinking says, always have a forward-looking perspective on what the results will be from what you do. And judging those results in terms of total happiness is what utilitarianism adds. Utilitarianism says the consequences are all that matter morally, but in particular, we're talking about the consequences as they bear on total human happiness. So again, utilitarian ethics says, bear in mind the consequences of each action that you can take, and the right action for you will be whichever one that generates the most total happiness for the greatest number of people. Okay, now let me go into a little bit of further detail about utilitarianism, because there's this important principle that the author Mill says serves as a kind of basis of support for utilitarian ethics. So here's like a little statement of principle that's supposed to give backing to the theory, and it's called the greatest happiness principle. He thinks this principle is obvious to most people and their intuition. So I'll write it down and we'll talk about it a little bit. Okay, so the greatest happiness principle just says this. It says that actions are right to the extent that they promote happiness, and actions are wrong to the extent that they promote the reverse of happiness. So I'll write that now. Okay, so what it says is this. Greatest happiness principle. So actions are right to the extent that they promote happiness, and actions are wrong to the extent that they promote the reverse of happiness. This terminology, to the extent that means it's just a matter of degree. So the more and more happiness that your action generates as a result, the better and better it is morally. Kind of on a sliding scale, right? So there could be more or less. There's levels to this. The same with the reverse. Insofar as your action promotes or causes the opposite of happiness, it's bad. And the more of that reverse of happiness that it generates, then the worse and worse that it is. Now, let's drill down for a moment into these terms, happiness and reverse of happiness. In our everyday usage, we probably think that that's just kind of vague and unspecified. What is happiness? But to the utilitarians, they kind of have a more precise understanding of it. According to Mill and others that follow this theory, happiness is just to be equated with pleasure and the absence of pain. So here I'm going to put that in our notes. Happiness, what is it? It is pleasure and the absence of pain. Okay, now I'm going to create a little room here so I can write a bit more notes, but so you know this is still the greatest happiness principle. This is just, I'm going to write GHP here to abbreviate. That's happiness, pleasure in the absence of pain. So then, just using logic and this definition, what do you feel then is the reverse of happiness? If happiness is pleasure in the absence of pain, then the reverse of happiness is what and what? It's something in the reverse, something in the absence of something. What is the reverse of happiness? You're just going to kind of spin off of this. Happiness, pleasure in the absence of pain. Reverse of happiness, what and the absence of what? Tell me how to write that definition if you can. Of reverse of happiness. Yeah, presence of pain in the absence of pleasure. So pain and the absence of pleasure. Pain in the absence of pleasure. So now, with a little bit more of a detailed feel for what the terms are being defined as here, we can return to the greatest happiness principle. What it's saying then is this. When you go out into the world and you do an action that causes pleasure for people or takes their pain away, that is judged as a good thing to do. And the more and more pleasure that you create or pain that you take away, then the better and better that your moral record would seem to be. Just as a random example, suppose that someone was like a surgeon, right, working at like a children's hospital, and they saved like a child's life by doing a skilled surgical procedure. By preventing this child from dying, they've secured all the pleasure for them that otherwise would have been eliminated through their death throughout the remainder of their life. So that's a lot of additional pleasure, and whatever pain was removed through the procedure and so forth is also a good thing. Now, if they did this to one person, saved one person's life and made their life more pleasurable, that would be great. But if they did it to 5, 10, 100, 1,000, their moral record just gets better and better, right? So on the opposite extreme, who's a bad person to common sense intuition? Well, someone that's doing the reverse, someone who's causing pain or taking people's pleasure away. Consider the case of, I don't know, like a killer, like a murderer. If a person is murdered, if one person is killed, this is a terrible tragedy because all of the future pleasure and experience they otherwise would have enjoyed is just eliminated. But killing one person is a tragedy, but imagine someone kills 5, 10, 100. Their moral record is worse and worse and worse. So it kind of compounds how bad it is, the more pain they create or the more pleasure that they annihilate. And, you know, as I said, there's levels to this. A person who did something bad to one person, we don't even have to talk about killing, right? There's all kinds of other ways that you can take pleasure away from others or increase their pain or vice versa, cause pleasure for people or take their pain away. You know, genocidal dictators, Hitler and stuff, killing millions of people, that's way on the far extreme. And then there's just all these shades of gray in between. Okay, so utilitarian ethics advises us in the following way. It says, when you're trying to figure out what you ought to do morally, take a look at the options that you are facing and consider which one would yield the greatest total amount of happiness for all affected. And whichever action that would be among your options, it'd be your moral obligation to do that. Now, the next little stage of our presentation here, and like I say, this is going to take 2 meetings for us, so we're going to still be working on Mill on Wednesday. But I wanted to kind of like diagram for you guys an easy little choice situation that will demonstrate how the theory works if you apply it to a given example. So we're going to have to resume with this on Wednesday. We won't be able to get through all of this little part of the lecture right now, but I want to at least set it up with the last few minutes. Okay, so here's a box which has 4 vertical columns in it, and it's also got 4 horizontal rows that cross through it, so that creates this grid of 16. Okay, now just help me set the graph up, and then we will reconstitute it at the beginning on Wednesday. But with your help, I would like to know 4 different types of pizza topping. Okay, so this is a pizza topping choice situation. And I'm sure you guys have all had pizza and you know what some of the popular topping selections could be. So what's one style of pizza familiar to most that I can label one of these columns with? Let me know. Just call out what you think would be a mainstream type of pizza or whatever. Okay, barbecue chicken, Nigel. It's already a little off the cuff, a little different, but I don't mind. So here, barbecue chicken, BBQC, that's what that stands for. But it's not the only one, I need 4. So something different from that, and another student will add that to the chat. Okay, so someone says cheese. Okay, I see Sydney. Cheese, big C, that stands for cheese. So we've got barbecue chicken, cheese, two more, different from both of those. Neither cheese nor barbecue chicken, but now a third possible option. What could it be? Dennis, I see writing combination. Maybe you mean like supreme or like whatever, it's got all the stuff. But I don't know, there's already too many C's, so maybe I'll move to another possible option. Go ahead, anybody, let me know. Pepperoni, okay. Clearly that's a very popular, well-known topping. Beef pepperoni. One more though, just need one more. Anybody, it's just gotta be something different from those three. Sausage, okay, fair enough, sausage. So barbecue chicken, cheese, pepperoni, sausage. Now, over here in the left 4 horizontal rows, I'm just going to place 4 names of students that are here in this class. Sorry I didn't get to put pineapple up there. I know that's a very divisive, controversial one, but we can debate that another time, I guess. Anyways, 4 students from the class. I just need you to help me to complete this exercise, and I want it to be 4 people that are for sure going to be here on Wednesday, because it'd be a little awkward if I come back Wednesday with the graph filled up and the student's not present. So anybody who's pretty much reliably going to make sure they'll be here on Wednesday, let me get your name, and I'm going to put 4 names here. You don't have to do anything. You're just going to have to answer a couple of questions about your preferences when it comes to these pizzas in the live chat. So go ahead, volunteer, and if I can get those names, then we'll end with that today, and we'll resume with this on Wednesday. So who's going to be the 4 that I can ask about their pizza preferences? Okay, Brandon, good. Brandon, I got you here. 3 more brave souls. Well, I don't know how much bravery it really takes, but 3 more souls. Okay, Zoe, good. And 2 more. Nigel, good. Finally, we have, who's the last one? Okay, thanks, Sydney. Got it. Okay, not to worry, everybody. I got 4 names. So here, just keep this in mind, and we'll begin with this on Wednesday. To the 4 people here, as you're looking at this graph and you see these 4 types of pizza, I want you to imagine you're going to give me a score, and the score is going to be a number between 0 and 50, and that's going to be standing for how much pleasure you think that pizza topping choice would give you specifically. And so your numbers should reflect your preferences, and everyone's preferences are a little different. So if you're a person who's just a lover of cheese pizza but you hate pepperoni, then you'd want to give this a higher score than pepperoni, like, I don't know, depending on the matrix of values 0 through 50. If it's your favorite, you might give it full 50. If you hate something and you don't like it at all, it might be 0, no pleasure. Something in between, 25, and all those intermediate values. So you know how sometimes people like 10 for 10, I would recommend, or whatever, blah, blah, blah. Well, this is 0 through 50, okay? So I'm just giving you a little bit of more of a range to play with instead of just a typical 0 through 10 rating system. But it's a pleasure score, okay? It's like how much pleasure, if you could somehow quantify that as a number. This is the pleasure score you give it out of 0 through 50. So when we come back on Wednesday, the 4 students here will let me know their various 4 numbers that I put in each box. And then we'll use those to generate a choice situation that a utilitarian would be able to give you a conclusion about. Okay, guys, so thanks again so much for all your help and your presence at the meeting. For now, I guess, just take care. I'll see you back on Wednesday. Same plan, same time. And hopefully now it's all kind of becoming routine. But anyway, thanks so much. And take it easy. I'll see you back on Wednesday, okay? Let me see in the stream if you're with me still. Just some goodbyes or anything else. We're good to go? Okay, thanks so much, everybody. Take it easy, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.